They told me once, when the moon was a coin and the city hummed like a living thing, that images carry votes. Not the kind counted in a hall with ballots and nameplates, but the kind that gather in the space just behind the eyes and decide what a person will become when the quiet hours come. A photograph, they said, is a little jury. The light and the shadow do the arguing, and the face in the frame is the defendant and the witness at the same time. I never imagined, though, that a single photograph of me would be taken into a room where 9 powerful people sat in a semicircle and that all of them would speak the same shocking sentence. You want the sentence? I'll give it to you the way it arrived. She remembers what the rest of us promised we would forget. It was not shouted, not whispered. It landed like a bell struck inside a cathedral that had been asleep for centuries. The sound of it held a clarity so precise that at once everything I had done and everything I had tried to bury rearranged themselves like cards in an old magician's trick. The sentence was an accusation and an invitation and a map and a blessing, all in one. Powerful people, when I finally met them later, were not what I had pictured. They didn't wear capes or crowns. One smelled faintly of cedar and piano polish, another moved like a branch and spoke like someone who had been to too many meetings and learned to hide heat under frost. There was a woman with a laugh like low thunder and a man whose hands had been written on by ink so often that his fingertips were darker than the rest of him. They wore tailored coats and shoes with invisible creases, yes, but their power, the kind that makes people shift without touching them, lived where you cannot fold a sleeve, in decisions, in habit loops, in the quiet language between finance and law, prayer and data, war and apology. They had all been shown the photograph. They had all leaned forward as one, and they had all said the same thing. You need to understand the photograph. It was not an image crafted for spectacle. It was honest in the way a childhood friend is honest. It told the truth without flattery. There I was, in the photograph, not because I wanted or expected to be immortalized, but because someone with a gentle camera had asked me to stand by an old gate at dusk and hold a single wilted marigold between my fingers. The sky in the background was that brittle green-gray that happens right before rain arrives with a mind of its own. My hair had the stubborn gravity of a cloud that refuses to be tamed. My face held something that almost looked like a secret smile but was more a settling of features around a thought. When I look at the photograph now, I can remember the moment in a way that's less about the body and more about the weather inside my own head, a kind of patient listening. People in the photograph treat memory like a costume sometimes. They drape it over themselves to fit a role they have been practicing for years. They limp forward with it when it doesn't suit them. But the photograph refused my performative memories. It captured a certain attention in me, the kind that comes when you stop trying to make yourself useful for other people's stories and begin to receive the story that wants you. There was an element of reckoning in my eyes, or the photographer's eyes, whichever you prefer. And that reckoning had weight enough that 9 people who carry the world in their pockets felt it. When news of the photograph reached those 9, the path it took was not direct. It traveled through a set of corridors where deals are hashed in handfuls of whispered syllables, where grief is occasionally used as an offer to be traded. In one room, a man opened the envelope the photograph arrived in and tilted his head, as if listening to something the paper was saying. He did not speak at first. Later he would say that the photograph reminded him of a promise he had once made, a promise to himself, before he learned how to trade promises for office keys. In another room, a woman who designs the architecture of cities saw in the photograph an outline for a bridge that had never been built because she had always been too busy building small, profitable walls. She felt a chill that made her stop tracing the glass with her fingertip. Across the table from her, a general, retired so as to be more dangerous in conversation, sighed like someone remembering a parade that hadn't gone right. The photograph, these powerful people discovered, kept a ledger. Some promises are made public. Treaties, patent filings, oaths sworn on cameras and microphones where the light is blunt. Other promises are private. They are tiny transactions between conscience and convenience, between the restless want for more and the soft voice that claims something better must be preserved. The photograph seemed to hold a ledger of both kinds, but it put special focus on those intimate promises that had been made and then quietly renegotiated. It recorded, as if on a permanent thumbnail, a particular kind of vow, the vows people make when they are young and frightened and convinced there's no other currency but the truth they can still afford to spend. Each of the 9 powerful people recognized something different in the photograph, yet all of them read the same line in the ledger. They saw that or rather, the person in the photograph, remembered the vows they had intentionally loosened. They saw in my face the reflection of a memory that refused to be sold. You should know that when a person holds a memory that powerful, they possess a lever which the world will attempt to pry from their hands. After the photograph's audition, I was not immediately contacted by any of the 9. There were rats of rumor scurrying in a dozen directions, and some of them brushed against my ankles. A message arrived on a plain card that smelled faintly of citrus and printer ink. We would like to speak. The message was unsigned. Its penmanship suggested both care and the habit of erasing signatures. I went because the part of me that the photograph had recorded wanted to know who else remembered the old promises. The meeting place was a house that lived at the end of a long, old street. It had a stoop with a crack like a mouth. Ivy clung to the bricks in a lazy embrace. Inside, the room smelled like lavender and old books. They were arranged in a semicircle, as if they had been waiting for a play to begin. The same 9 people sat there, the pianist in a gray coat who made his decisions like a long exhale, the architect with her blueprint fingers, the retired general who kept his medals in a drawer and his regrets in his pockets, the woman with thunderlaugh, the man who had ink on his fingertips, and the rest, each an atlas of small powers, each used to reshaping other people's landscapes. When I stood in front of them, my heart behaved like an animal being shown a new path. The photograph was on the table between us, a small, quiet thing. They looked at it and then at me, and then they came to the sentence, not like people assembling a verdict but like people recognizing the first line of a poem they had once written together and then refused to finish. She remembers what the rest of us promised we would forget. 9 identical responses, spoken at once or at the same, deliberate cadence. The words hummed in the air like a tuning fork. I tried to respond with the usual devices: denial, irony, an attempt at mystique. None of them fit. Denial felt like a paper shield in a rainstorm. Irony sounded brittle and belonged on a stage. Instead, I let a silence occupy the space for a long time, the kind of silence that requires a new object to be placed in it, a marigold, perhaps, or a small, honest confession, and so I said, simply, I remember what I need to remember. They looked at me as if I had spoken a secret in a language they had always known but stopped using. One of them, the pianist, smiled in a way that removed all the formality from the room. He said, "Then tell us." The telling is complicated. Memory is not chronological, it does not line up like train cars. It is associative and fractal. Sometimes a smell will go off like a fuse and the whole of your childhood spills out in an image of a single window. Sometimes memory is deliberate, a file you pull forward in the night when you are thirsty and it seems like the only thing that can deliver cool water. When I tried to explain, I had to choose a lane to drive down. I chose the lane of small, luminous facts. I told them about the promises as if they were pieces of furniture. Promise 1, to protect a place of refuge for people who had nowhere to be quiet. Someone, many someones, had agreed, in those bright early years, that a certain town would be kept for solitude and smallness, that factories and billboards would not bleed into its margins. That promise had been entertainment to some at first, a quaint, old idea. But promises are like seeds. They either grow into trees or they are uprooted. Over decades, deals were made that chipped away, often legally and always politely, until the sanctuary I had loved was bracketed by commerce and signage. I had watched that erosion, and I remembered the original compact because I had been there the night the document was pressed into a hand and sealed with meager bread and a lot of hope. Promise 2, to keep a list, incomplete, of names that the world was trying to forget in order to forget the cost. This was not a famous list. It was a list of people who had been swallowed by policies and paperwork, the ones who answered a call and never returned, the ones who were given promises in exchange for silence, the ones who believed in a certain future and were told they would be part of it. These names had been drafted onto a ledger and then quietly crossed out by people who had other accounts to balance. Remembering the names was an act of stubbornness, and naming them was like turning a key that the powerful had misplaced. Promise 3, a vow between two people who were too young to be strategists but brave enough to believe in care. They had made a pledge, to never betray a particular act of mercy, during a winter when the nights were long and the city had been kind in small ways. The promise had been as fragile as a glass in your hand, but it had been kept for a while. Then, one day, an exchange was made and the mercy had been traded, and that trade would ripple for decades. I remembered holding the shape of that mercy in my pocket like a coin and pressing it closed when others wanted to spend it. With each telling, their faces altered. Sometimes they tightened, like the skin on a stretched drum. Sometimes they leaned back, as if the air suddenly had less weight. One of them, the woman with thunder laugh, began to cry quietly. Her face changed in a way I will not forget, the unaccustomed softness of someone who remembers an act of kindness they had helped to dismantle. The retired general's jaw worked like someone counting battalions. The architect folded and refolded a napkin until it resembled a blueprint of nothing. The pianist, palms on his knees, said at last, "We are not innocent of these things." They meant it. There was no theatrical confession, no dramatic knifing of their reputations on the table. They meant it in the way that people who have built their lives on numbers mean anything, with the slow, corrosive knowledge that small concessions calcify into monuments that no longer belong to their makers. Their admission did not dissolve the consequence of those bargains. It acknowledged it like a name on a roster. It was the moment when politics and conscience passed through each other and left a residue. After the admissions, the room shifted into a peculiar productiveness that felt part negotiation, part therapy. This is what power does when it is confronted with the mirror. It either sharpens itself into more cunning or it softens enough to allow repair. They were curious, not only in that clinical way of the wealthy who find everything an experiment, but in a way that contained a sliver of hope. The sliver was small and oddly stubborn. It said, maybe, having recognized the lack, we can choose otherwise. They wanted to offer me a proposal, which was their natural mode of conversation. Proposals were their native language: mitigate here, redirect funds there, appoint a commission, name a building after a past that is more palatable. They wanted to use their levers to fix what had been broken. It should have been flattering. It was terrifying. Offers made by people who hold power are often like nets. They catch and secure, yes, but they also hold. A proposal might ensure preservation of certain memories, but it might demand a trade, the quieting of particular names, the reshaping of a narrative to fit a more marketable past. I had learned already that memory can be seduced. I surprised them by refusing. That room had never seen a refusal in the raw. People declined calls, ignored emails, negotiated harder, but outright refusal when the table had been laid with attention and resources felt like a small rebellion. I refused because the photograph, and the past it reflected, was not a thing to be brokered into a brand. The memories were not artifacts to be preserved in the amber of some foundation's logo. They were living things. To put them into the neat category of a project would kill them softly. They blinked as if the word had landed on them like a cold hand. One of them, the man with inked fingers, asked me why. He wanted, for reasons that felt both aesthetic and fiscal, an explanation. I offered a simple one, because remembering is the work itself. Altering me to be more palatable is replacing the work with a product. He nodded slowly, and I think somewhere inside him a ledger was updated. We spoke for hours. Power has a way of insulating conversation, of stretching it out into an elastic that can take almost anything you throw within it and still return to shape. I kept thinking of the marigold between my fingers in the photograph, how small, how ordinary, how stubbornly alive. It became a symbol in our talk. When they asked what we could do, I told them in the blunt language of small tasks: return land to public hands, reopen sealed case files, publish the names that had been erased, offer reparations that were not merely monetary but restorative, create spaces where people could tell the stories they had been forbidden to tell. Those proposals required less capital than they did courage. They required a deliberate willingness to be uncomfortable. Not all of them agreed. A few proposed soft compromises: name a wing, fund a festival, create a scholarship. Those are tidy concessions. They look good for press releases and they allow institutions to breathe the thin air of redemption while business continues. But the photograph had not been posing for a photo op. It had been caught in the act of remembering. I pressed instead for larger accountability, because promises that are dismantled at the small scale are often rebuilt with bigger stones, and unless you dismantle the architecture of forgetting, you anchor the next round of forgetfulness. At one point, the general told a story about a night in a different city, a different war, where he had been young enough to believe in brightness and old enough to be entrusted with a command that required him to choose which lives to expose and which to shield. He had chosen, he said, and later he had redacted certain truths to keep a particular stability. Stability, he explained, is a shape that often requires small cruelties. Hearing him speak, I felt, in a particular way, how close memory and policy sit at the same kitchen table. They are always arguing about whether the house of state should be comfortable or righteous. You remember, he said finally. Most people do not remember. Most people prefer the comfortable lie. I answered, most people forget for a long list of good reasons. Fear, convenience, the bargaining with reputation. But remember, to make memory public is often to make pain public. People protect themselves. He put his hand on the photograph as if to feel the weight through the paper. For a moment, the room softened. I think, in that moment, we all sensed that memory is not simply a ledger of the past, it is the raw material of future belonging. A community that remembers together learns how to repair itself. A community that agrees to forget, again and again, rewires its moral center toward expediency. When we finished, the architect leaned forward and said, "We can use our tools." We can do this in a way that holds the difficulties instead of hiding them. The pianist added, music has a place for dissonance. We can let it be part of the composition. The ink-fingered man tapped his lip and murmured, I can draft something. Even the general nodded, though his nod was an economy of motion, as if each one cost him. Offers were made in different tongues, some of law, some of philanthropy, some of old-fashioned muscle. None of them were perfect. Perfection, I have learned, is a cover story for delay. We agreed on a first act rather than a plan, because plans can become prisons and acts can remain alive. The first act would be small, honest, and public. The 9 would sponsor, not dominate, a series of public hearings where people whose names had been erased could tell their stories, in order, with support, and those stories would be recorded and committed to public repositories with no redaction. The idea was radical in its simplicity: give a voice back and then let the community decide what to do with what it hears. The hearings would be accompanied by land lease reviews, a careful untangling of the contracts that had eaten the sanctuary. Money would be allocated not as a bribe but as a resource for repair, to fund small communal projects started and run by those most affected. The proposals refused the comfort of monuments and instead oriented toward repair. It is perhaps naive to believe that a single photograph could start such a chain. But ideas have an appetite for opportunity, and the photograph was an opportunity that revealed a backlog of conscience. The 9 powerful people, embarrassed and intrigued, had some levers and an appetite to use them differently. They also had histories and a taste for self-preservation. The truth is that the work moved forward in fits and starts. It involved committees, delays, and the familiar human tendency to circle the problem as if aligning faces to a map. There were setbacks: a proposed land transfer stalled in legal review. A name was initially left off a list because some thought it politically messy. A budget line disappeared into administrative overhead. At each misstep, I felt the old memory stir, waiting for me to name it loud enough that it would not be swallowed. Naming is a radical act. When you say a name aloud, you pull it from the room where it has been suffocating and set it at the center of a table. You give it a chair. Names, once spoken, begin to bend the shapes of policy. They demand records, they demand checks, they demand the slow arithmetic of accountability. It is a clumsy process. It is messy and human and not theatrical. But it is effective in a way that grand promises are not. Over the months that followed, small victories were scored. There were hearings where people stood in front of microphones and spoke with a clarity that surprised them. Some began to cry, others laughed in bewildered relief at finding rooms where they were heard. A park was designated as a community trust again, with a board that included people who had lived through the losses. A list of names was published with biographies, trimmed of romanticism and filled with the simple facts that make people real: where they lived, what they loved, how they were lost. The act of publication did not erase the pain, but it did reduce the room for denial. I did not become a symbol. The photograph did not turn me into a cause celebrity. What it did was change the way the people who could change things thought about their obligations. They had been confronted with a mirror and chose, sometimes, to act. That is as astonishing a transformation as I have seen in my lifetime. It is not absolute. It is not perfect. But it is real. What I learned in that time, and this is the part the 9 had to be reminded of and I had to be humble about, is that memory cannot be delegated. People cannot outsource the act of remembering to philanthropies or commissions. When a society decides which memories to archive and which to let the weather eat, it is performing a moral calculation about what kind of future it wants to inhabit. Erecting plaques and funding festivals are ways of managing grief so it is comfortable to attend to. Real remembering is dirtier. It asks for the inconvenient and the painful. It requires public listening and a willingness to shift advantage. The photograph taught me another simple thing. Sometimes, being the person who remembers is a lonely job. You stand with something that has weight, and often the world will propose to you ways to make that weight look pretty while actually diluting it. People with power will show up with pens and plans and a hunger for optics. This is not always cynical, often it is merely habitual. But part of the work was learning when to accept resources and when to refuse them because their conditions would hollow out the memory. There were moments when I failed at this. There were times I accepted small comforts that made the hearings look more palatable to the media, or I agreed to a press release that sanitized some of the uglier facts. Later, I would regret those compromises. Regret taught me to sharpen my thresholds. You have both to be open to help and vigilant about how help arrives. The 9 were changed, too. The pianist began funding music programs not as philanthropy but as a practice in community ownership. The architect used her relationships to lobby for zoning changes that favored communal gardens over parking lots. The general taught at a veterans program where he did not tell stories of valor but of the trouble of obeying when orders contradict conscience. The ink-fingered man published an essay, uncomfortable and gorgeous, about the cost of convenient narratives. Change took the geometry of their talents and turned it into small, public acts that had ripple effects. We were released, eventually, from the solemnity of the first mornings. The photograph remained in my life like a small weather pattern. Sometimes it was sunny, sometimes stormy. It had done what it needed to do, opened an axis of attention, and then it settled into being a resource. People continued to argue in committees. They continued to forget sometimes. They also continued to name sometimes. My job, as the person who had been catalogued in that small frame, was not to police remembrances but to keep the attention alive. Years later, I returned to that gate where the photograph had been taken. The marigold was gone, the seasons had replaced it in a dozen minor ways. I stood in the same posture, not for the camera but to see if inside my chest the photograph had altered the topology of myself. I found it had. Memory had become less an ornament and more a practice. I sought out names that had been published and learned their stories, not as a tourist but as a neighbor. I supported a small cooperative that took over a lot that had almost been sold. I stood at hearings and sometimes listened, and sometimes told. The arc was not one of singular heroics. It was an accumulation of small, stubborn acts. When people ask me what the 9 powerful people meant by their uniform sentence, I tell them this: they recognized in me a refusal to allow forgetting to be comfortable. They saw in my face, in the photograph, the kind of remembrance that insists on being messy, communal, and persistent. They feared it because it demanded redistribution, of attention, of land, of historical narrative, and power, properly understood, is reluctant to redistribute. And yet they also recognized a possibility. They recognized that if people in places of influence choose to reorient their uses of power, to redirect funds, to open records, to allow communities to set terms for their own repair, the downstream effects are profound. This is not a clean moral tale in which villains are unmasked and heroism is sanctified. It is messy, like a long table where people bring different foods and sometimes eat together. So what does it mean for you, if your own photograph found its way into a room of 9 powerful strangers? It means you are witness to a kind of leverage. It means your memory may be becoming a vector for accountability. It means you must be careful with offers of help because help is often a contract in disguise. It means your remembrance can be contagious, not like a disease, but like curiosity, and that curiosity can lead people who are used to moving the world with closed hands to open them, clumsily but with intent. If you are afraid, and many people are, remember something smaller. Name one person who deserves to be named, and say it out loud. Make a small map of promises in your own life. Who promised you refuge? Who promised you credit for your work? Who promised to remember your story? Start there. There is infinite utility in beginning small. People with power will come to the table for reasons both generous and self-interested. You will have to be the first guardrail. Name the bargain you will not allow. There are moments when the world will try to buy your memory. It will offer a foundation, a plaque, a chair on a board, and with these come conditions that can erode what you hold. Sometimes the price is small, silence about certain names, a softer framing. Sometimes the price is large, a reorientation of truth that sells you as a symbol rather than a witness. Always weigh the offer against the thing remembered. Ask, does this help the people I remember or does it make my memory convenient? People often want a single instruction: keep this, avoid that. Life does not yield to simple checklists. But there is a way to proceed that echoes what the photograph taught me: hold to the work of remembering as ongoing practice, invite the people who can materially help to do so in ways that are accountable and ceding of control, and never let the final form of a memory be decided solely by those who gain from its commodification. The rest is messy: committees, negotiations, public statements, terrible legal forms, but remember that the mess is the point. The mess is where people who have lost something can be present to demand repair. When I think back to the 9, I do not think of them as villains or heroes. I think of them as human beings who had made bargains and were capable of remaking them. The photograph taught me that power can also be an instrument of restoration if wielded with humility. It taught me that memory has teeth when it is made public in the right ways. It taught me that people who remember can shift the arc of the future not by shouting louder but by naming deliberately and making persistent, patient demands for justice. So the next time a photograph of you is shown before people who can change the world, and they say in unison something shocking about the nature of forgetting, listen. That shock might be the sound of possibility. It might also be a test. Decide whether you will let your memory be polished into a trophy or whether you will hold it like a working tool, bruise it into use, and let it shape the world into something more honest. Because at the heart of it, the smallest revelation you can offer the powerful is not an accusation, it is an invitation. It is the invitation to join in an inconvenient practice. It is the asking to be part of repair rather than spectacle. And that invitation, once issued, will teach both you and them that small acts of remembering, the naming, the listing, the holding of shame until it can be turned into amendment, are the only real currency that will buy back dignity. There is a finality that people like to imagine about moments like the one in the photograph, the neat ending where everyone agrees and everything is repaired. That does not happen. What happens instead is iterative. The powerful learn to be a little less comfortable with convenience. The community learns to insist a little more loudly. The record grows, as do the hearings and the small acts of repair. It is slow. It is human. It is worth it. If you should ever find yourself in front of such a circle, remember the marigold. Hold what you remember close and offer it carefully. Be ready to refuse gifts that will hollow the work. Be ready to accept help that gives power away. And above all, when they say, in chorus, she remembers what the rest of us promised we would forget, know that the sentence is both an accusation and a mirror. It is an opportunity. It is a test and a map. How you use it will shape not only your life but the small world you inhabit with everyone else, the town by the river, the names on the list, the children who will inherit the shapes you choose to leave behind.